family lived and worked in Manhattan, Lower Manhattan, at 196 Hudson Street from 1833 until 1838. CF had partners. Some were relatives, friends. They would come and go in the business. We've got a C.F. Hartman guitar here and a C.F. Hartman violin. And back then, there was still a lot of like, well, what should a guitar be? What exactly is a guitar? And so these are Martin Renaissance guitars. As we do this tour, I'm going to point out some stuff. It's like, don't ask me why we made them. CF thought somebody might want them, and people bought them. They didn't buy very many of them because we stopped making them. And violins. Here's a couple of violins because, there is certainly a connection. And even in the kind of music. Think about bluegrass. Bluegrass has a guitar, mandolin, bass, violin often, banjo. So there's, even though there was some animosity between CF and the violin makers, anything with strings on it, I'm okay. I believe it was my great-great-great-grandmother who convinced my great-great-great-grandfather to move to Pennsylvania. She had some friends who had settled in the Lehigh Valley from Europe that she knew, she and CF, and she came out to visit. And I gotta tell you, driving into Marknerkirchen, it looked like Bushkill Township. I mean, it looked like this part of Pennsylvania, rolling hills. And then when you get to Marknerkirchen, here's this town built into the side of the rolling hills. And so I'm sure when she came out here, what did she find? People spoke German. They cooked German food at the holidays. They celebrated the holidays very similar to the way they did in the old world. And you've probably heard that term, Pennsylvania Dutch. It's kind of a misnomer. It's really Pennsylvania Deutsch. It has nothing to do with Holland. It has a lot to do with the fact that German immigrants settled in this part of Pennsylvania and throughout eastern and central Pennsylvania, the Amish, the Mennonites. And here in the Lehigh Valley, some of the original settlers were the Moravians. So my family decided to move to Pennsylvania, and they wanted to live in Nazareth. Nazareth was settled in 1740 by a religious sect. It's kind of a branch of the Protestant religion. And they had a benefactor, Count Zinzendorf. And Count Zinzendorf had a goal, and he needed missionaries to go to the New World and convert the heathens, the Indians, the Native Americans, to Christianity. The initial attempt was challenging because the Indians were like, what are you doing here in the first place? Where did you come from? I thought this was our land. What do you mean it's your land? What do you mean you have to buy land and just sell land? That's a very foreign concept to them. And so their response to these very well-meaning missionaries who are trying to convert them to worship a God that they never heard of, they scalped them. That was their way of saying, you could go back to Europe. That would be a solution. And so the Moravians said, well, we're not going back to Europe. We're committed to this. Maybe we should get together in a town. It'll be a little safer. And so in 1740, Nazareth was formed. So my family comes to the Lehigh Valley, the Nazareth area, in 1839. And they knew at that point that they were not allowed to live in Nazareth because they weren't born Moravian. So they bought a piece of property right top of the hill. That's where the family worked and lived from 1839 until 1859. Because in 1858, the town incorporated itself, let in the outsiders. My family by then had become Moravian, and we bought the property down at the corner of North and Main Street. And one of the reasons that CF Sr. wanted to get property in town was the hill. It was horse and buggy, right? And you got this hill like this. Not a good combination in the winter. He said it was very challenging just to go to the post office in December. And if you had to ship a guitar, you had to go down that hill, go to the post office, then you had to come home. So everybody was happy that we were allowed to move into town. And so I'm going to talk in a moment, in the case that I'm at, about this book. Because honestly, before that book was written, I didn't even know what kind of questions to ask about why on earth did he stop making these and start making these. Dick Boak comes to me and says, Chris, how do you feel about letting a bunch of guitar scholars, yes there are guitar scholars, into our facility to take a look at our collection, our instruments, our archival material? They want to bring some of their instruments. I said, well, what's the purpose of it, Dick? And he said they want to try and figure out why did CF stop making Stauffer style guitars and start making guitars that looked like this. I said, yeah, that would be a very interesting thing. Without reading the book verbatim, what came out of that study was the conclusion. When people pictured a guitar in their mind, they tended to picture what we know today as the Spanish classic guitar, not a Stauffer guitar. The authors, the scholars said, we believe CF came to the realization that he could sell more guitars if he made guitars that looked like the guitars that people pictured in their minds. After the book was published, thanks to our connection to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, they had an exhibit. And the exhibit was to kind of walk you through this thought process of CF's that took him from Stauffer to the more modern Martin guitar. And you can already start to see elements of today's Martin guitar in this guitar. So the first time I went to the exhibit, as soon as I got there, I was mild. And the second time I went to the exhibit, I was mild. The third time I said, I'm gonna go early. And I wanna just go in there by myself and get a sense of what's going on in this exhibit. What they had were mostly Martin guitars, but they had a couple of early Spanish classic guitars. And that was where the authors made the connection. They said, Chris, we think we know what was going on in his head. So I'm like, okay, so I'm looking at these Spanish guitars. Now this is what, 1830s, 1840s, made at that time primarily in Cadiz, which is down in the Mediterranean, hard, right, like, man, you can almost see Morocco. It's hot and humid, pretty much all the time. And so as much as the Spanish builders wanted to export, and that's an important part of the guitar economy in Spain, is not just building guitars for Spain, but export. So they started to export these guitars to the New World. And unfortunately for them, the guitars didn't survive. They were not able to adjust from hot and humid to cold and dry in the winter. And so the scholars who wrote the book said CF must have come to the realization that he could build a better mousetrap.